Hey guys, welcome back to video 4. So in this video we're going to look at some basic vocal processing. And what this is going to entail is pretty much the process that you would go through before you actually add effects and EQs and all that kind of stuff to make it sound pretty. We want to actually clean up the vocals first so that they're ready to use. The chances are when you record vocals you're going to be left with a lot of breaths and just some background noise, depends on the type of microphone you're using and whether your room is actually sound treated or not. So having a soundproofed room, one that's treated, is going to help a lot because you're not going to get reverb off of the walls and you're not going to have much background noise. So, traffic, neighbors, whatever it might be, you might have roommates or something like that. Even an air conditioner, a TV in the background, all that stuff can leak into your vocals or into your recordings. So it's just something to be aware of as well. Now, it will depend on the type of microphone you're using. So if you're using a dynamic microphone, which is the one that I'm speaking on right now, these are unidirectional and they take to loud noises quite well while blocking out a lot of the background noise. The only thing with dynamic microphones is they won't pick up those subtle quiet noises as well as a condenser microphone. So for a lot of studio environments or where you do have a sound treated room, you'd probably go with a condenser microphone because it's a lot more sensitive and you'll pick up a lot more subtleties. But for me, I live on quite a busy street, so there's a lot of traffic, there's trains, trucks, buses, all those kinds of things, and they actually don't come through in my recordings as much, as you can tell right now as I'm talking. So I'll probably cover this in a little more detail in the next video, but I just wanted to bring that up now. So this vocal here was recorded on a dynamic microphone, and also the room was sound treated, so there's not much background noise, but it is still there. So what we're going to take a look at doing is cleaning this up a little bit, a couple of effects that we can use. And then we'll also take a look at a little bit of auto-tuning inside of Ableton. So let's listen to this vocal. It was a female vocalist that I had in the studio about a year ago now. It is quite quiet, so I have to put a utility on this. I'm just going to put up the gain a bit. The gain was set quite low on the audio interface itself, which is why it's so quiet. That's another thing you have to keep in mind if you do have an audio interface, is that you can adjust the gain for the individual inputs themselves. But you don't necessarily want to crank up the gain so much so that this waveform is up here, because then you're going to start to get clipping and you'll also get a little bit of distortion and saturation from the interface itself. So I do like to have the gain set relatively low on my interface, and then that gives me a lot of room to play with inside of Ableton. And also the more gain you drive into the interface itself, the more you'll pick up background noise. So they all sort of tie into each other in one way or another. I don't want it. But let's listen to this vocal. I don't want to die young. I don't want to grow old. I just want to live life. Hope there is an afterlife. Okay, I'll just bring it back a bit because she clipped at the end there. First thing I'm going to do is put a spectrum on this so we can actually see what's going on. Now straight away I'm playing here, there's no sound, but if you watch the spectrum, there's actually quite a bit going on. These numbers here on the left hand side refer to the decibels, and then you got the frequency up the top. So while negative, it's kind of peaking around negative 50-ish. While that is quite low, it is still information that's there, which is going to impact our mix in the end. Once we, bring everything up to scratch, up to volume, we really don't want that extra information in there. So how can we get rid of it? Obviously, we could come in and just delete the parts that we don't need. So where she's not singing, we can just delete that. But if you have an entire vocal track, which is, let's say 2.5, 3 minutes long, it can be quite tedious to go in and get rid of every single gap in the words, and it's going to take you a long time. So an easy way we can get around this is to use something called a gate, which is in our audio effects. So I'm going to put a gate on here, and then I'm just going to duplicate this spectrum and then put one after the gate. We can see the before and the after. I'm going to leave all these gaps here, just so we can see how the gate works and how powerful it can be in reducing that background noise. Now this doesn't just apply to vocals, you can use the gate on any of your recordings, so like we did in the last video where we recorded all those samples. Let's say you have a lot of background noise and you're not in a treated environment, or you're using a headset or a USB microphone, whatever it might be to record your sounds, you might have picked up a lot of background noise. So this is going to be a handy way that we can get rid of that. So to start off with the gate, we have a threshold here. So just to give you a brief overview of what the gate actually is, it's quite self-explanatory. It literally acts like a gate. So we have this threshold here. Whenever our sound peaks above the threshold, the gate is going to open up and let that sound through. Otherwise, if the volume is below this threshold of our sound, the gate is going to shut, and it's essentially just going to leave it closed so there's no volume at all. There's no sound. So every time a sample or a vocal, whatever it might be, whatever your sound is in here, peaks above this, it will let it in. So that's exactly what the threshold is at what point does the gate open, and we can adjust this to suit our vocal. So if I set it up here, we're not going to get anything because our threshold is too high and the volume just isn't hitting that threshold. So it's not letting anything through. So we can start to bring this down. I'm just going to loop this section of vocal. We can start to bring this threshold down until we hear some words. You'll notice the more that I bring it down, the more that's going to be let through. So I'll leave it here, but one thing you can notice is even though a lot of the words are getting through, that D for die, the D, it's getting cut off a little bit. So what we can do is bring this threshold down until we hear that a little more clearly. There we go. So now we're getting the beginning of that die coming through a little more clearly. Let's just check the rest of the vocal. You'll notice, if you have a look down the bottom here, as I play the vocal, it's letting all this through, and then whatever's under this line gets cut out. So if I play it from the start, you can see all that noise there is getting cut out. That one got through. So our threshold, just need to bring it up a little bit. So all that noise is getting cut out, and these words are getting let through.
I just wanna live life. Hope there is an afterlife. I don't want.
Okay, and then a little peak got through at the end there, but pretty much at this threshold, all the words are getting let through, and then we're cutting out all of that background noise when there's no singing occurring. Let's take a look at some of the other controls in the gate. So we have a return here. Basically, the return is the buffer between the gate being closed and then opening. So if we didn't have any buffer and it was just set to 0 decibels, it's pretty much going to be a very harsh line where the gate opens and closes. So this can affect the way it works and how it sounds. And you're really going to notice that there's a gate on it.
I don't wanna die young.
And some of the words have a chance of being chopped off as well because there's no buffer and that crossover point is so harsh without our return. You can get some weird effects. So it will sound like the words will come out of nowhere and then they'll just get chopped off. So I like to have a little bit of buffer there. Usually the default's fine around 3 decibels.
I don't wanna die young.
You can always add more if you want. Down here we have some controls. So we have the attack and release. We already know what those do when we started the synthesis. It's exactly the same on the gate. So the attack will determine how long it takes for the gate to actually open once you cross that threshold, once we cross this threshold here. So if we set this up, you'll notice that the volume takes a little while to creep up.
I don't wanna die. I don't
You can notice it there at the start of the sentence. If I bring this back
I don't wanna die.
and put this back to full,
I don't wanna die.
so you can kind of smooth off how the gate works once again but I always like to leave this quite low, otherwise you get that fading in and out effect. And the release is the same thing. Once you go back down below the threshold, how long does it take for the gate to shut? Now the hold, what this essentially is once you cross the threshold, so once we go over this line, what's the minimum amount of time that the gate will stay open? So let's say you have a short little peak that crosses over the threshold really quickly. If you have this set up, let's say 1.5 seconds, even though you cross that really quickly and come back down, it will still open for 1.5 seconds because we set that minimum time in the hold. So that's another thing you can play around with. Usually default's fine though. So with the floor, let's have a look at our spectrum. I'll just loop this beginning section here where there's nothing happening. So to start off with, let's look at this orange line which indicates when the gate is actually on. And I'll play a section where there's nothing happening. And then I'll keep playing it so we cross over into the vocal, and just watch this orange line here. So the gate is on, and now it's off. Even though the gate is on here, and we look at these spectrums, so there's sound occurring here, we shouldn't have sound here. The reason why there is still information here, even though the gate is chopping off the volume, is because our floor is set to -40. So what the floor is when the gate is shut, what does it set the volume of the input signal to? So if we look at the numbers while I'm playing nothing here, on the left, you can see this is kind of around -60 decibels. Because we have the floor set to -40, this is sitting at -100-ish. So if we wanted the floor to be dead silent, absolutely no information whatsoever, we can reduce this to -infinite. And now you can see there's no information at all. So essentially, once the gate is on, it is being completely silenced. So if you're really worried about those background sounds creeping through, you know, -40, you're never going to hear it, and it's not really going to affect your mix too much. But if you really want to be methodical about it, you can just set this to infinite. That way there's absolutely no information whatsoever when the gate is shut. Because the floor is so low as well now, you might want to mess with the return a little bit, the buffer, because the gate now has to go from -infinite being shut to when it crosses over the threshold being wherever we set this to. Because it's a much longer way to travel, the crossover is going to be a little more dramatic, so we have to tweak this. But more often than not, you'll be fine with the default. Let's listen to it without the gate to start. You notice you can hear at the start there's a little breath, and you're just going to get this naturally on a lot of vocal tracks, pretty much every vocal track, unless you're not human, because we all have to breathe. So some artists like to leave some breaths in, because it adds a bit of character to the track. But a lot of commercial releases, they don't want any of that raw, natural sound. So they want to make it sound as clean and commercial as possible, and they'll cut out all the breaths and everything. Because we've set our gate threshold to where only the words are getting through, we should be able to get rid of a lot of those breaths automatically. You'll notice at the start, we actually get rid of that breath. Whereas if I take this off, we can hear that. Hopefully you can hear that. If you're on headphones, you should be able to. I'll just crank this up a little bit. That part there. Put the gate on. And it gets cut out. Set threshold back.
I don't want it. I don't want it.
There's also a lot of, like crackles and stuff, just from general mouth movements that can get through when you're recording vocals, and the gate can also be a way that you can get rid of those if you wish to get rid of them.
I just wanna live life. Hope there is an afterlife.
The main thing I'm listening out for is that we're not actually cutting off any words. That's the last thing you want to do, is have a gate that's so harsh that you're actually chopping off some pronunciation of the words.
I just wanna live. I just wanna live life.
That's pretty good. So see how there's that little peak there jumping through at the start? I don't want to increase my threshold even more because we're going to start to chop off words. So the way to get around that is just to get rid of any parts that are jumping through. Just actually getting rid of it in the audio track itself. That way you don't have any information there. So the gate will do, 90% of the work, but there might be that little 10% creeping through, which you'll just have to go in and get rid of manually. So that's all fine. That's all good.
I just wanna live life. Hope there is an afterlife.
And then just at the end there, we had some background noise creeping through. I'm just going to get rid of that as well. Make sure I don't chop off any of the actual vocal.
Afterlife.
So we've cleaned up this vocal, we've automatically gotten rid of the breaths and any of those little clicks and pops and also the background noise that was there. Now what we're going to take a look at doing is actually doing some auto-tune. So if you're a vocalist and you haven't used auto-tune before, don't be too scared off by the term. Just because I say auto-tune doesn't mean you have to sound like Travis Scott or T-Pain. And I'd be quite comfortable in saying that 99% of the tracks that you've heard, especially on the radio or commercially released music, it all has been auto-tuned in one way or another. So, even singers of the likes of Beyonce, Ed Sheeran, Shawn Mendes, they've all been auto-tuned. Because at the end of the day, they are human, and they're going to have some subtle offsets in the pitch, so it's impossible for them to be absolutely pitch perfect all the time. But just because they've been auto-tuned doesn't mean that they're bad singers. They're all incredibly talented. And when I say they've been auto-tuned, I don't mean that they've turned into T-Pain. It's used very subtly just to make sure they're locked into the key and the right notes. So even this girl here, she's a really good singer, she's really talented, but even she had some offsets in the pitch, which we'll have a look at. I'm just going to get rid of these spectrums now that we can see what's going on. And I'll leave the gate on, ready for us to do some auto-tune. One thing I'm going to quickly show you is an auto-tune plugin. So I have this one here called Waves Tune Real Time. Now this is an auto-tune plugin, so it pretty much automatically tunes it. You can select what scale the vocalist is singing in, and then you have a bunch of options here that will determine how harsh the auto-tune is. So if we wanted to get that Travis Scott effect, we would make it as harsh as possible. So the snapping is basically instant, and there's no smoothing in between the notes. Let's listen to this.
I don't wanna die young. I don't wanna grow old. I just wanna live life. Hope there is an afterlife.
So you get the point. You can hear that the auto-tune is definitely there. And it sounds very robotic. A lot of artists, like the two that I've been mentioning, T-Pain, Travis Scott, they do use this harshly because that's the effect that they like. But that doesn't mean they can't sing, especially T-Pain, who for years I actually gave him a lot of stick because I thought he couldn't sing and that he just used auto-tune in this way because he had to make up for his lack of ability. But when I actually watched him live, I was completely blown away by how good he was at singing, and he had an unreal voice. And then that's when it kind of stood out to me that he just liked the way that auto-tune sounds, and a lot of artists do that. Especially in hip-hop, it's used a lot just for the effect itself, not so much because they're terrible singers and they're trying to make up for it, but because they like the way it sounds. So you can use it this way as well. But if we're talking in a more traditional vocalist singer sense, you probably wouldn't want something this harsh. So what we can do is ease off the transitions, and then if we listen to this now,
I don't wanna die young. I don't wanna grow old. I just wanna live life. Hope there is an afterlife.
and you can hear it's much more subtle now than before, where it was just snapping to the notes and it sounded very robotic. Now we keep a lot of the naturalness, but we're actually correcting her pitch so that she's perfectly on pitch for each note. So I'm going to get rid of this. I just wanted to show you a auto-tune plugin. That is the easiest way to auto-tune, but that doesn't mean it's not possible within Ableton with built-in plugins. So let's get stuck into this one. I'm going to bring out something that we've seen before. I think it was week 3 or 4. Week 4 when we looked at sampling. Find out the key of the samples. We got a tuner again. I didn't really go into much detail about it at the time, so I'll just cover a little bit more now. These numbers that you see here, so we got the 0, -50 and +50, they refer to the cents. So there are 100 cents in a semitone. If I double click this, when we transpose it, we're transposing it by semitones. And within each of those semitones, we have 100 cents that we can play with to do some really fine tuning to the pitch. So if we take a look at this while the vocal is playing.
I don't wanna die young.
Now you can actually see what notes she's trying to hit for each of these words.
I don't wanna die young.
Just for the record, this technique definitely works better for sustained notes because you're going to be able to see a little more clearly which note is trying to be hit. Whereas if the vocalist is pitching up and down quite quick, it can be really tricky when you're trying to watch this.
I don't wanna die young.
Especially there, where she goes up and down so quickly.
I don't wanna die young.
Quite tricky to see what she's trying to hit. So let's narrow down a sustained note somewhere. Let's try and find... Okay, so I'm going to skip over this little glide up and just get that last bit. And we're going to auto-tune this part. So the way we can auto-tune in Ableton is by chopping up our audio track and then using the tuner to figure out which note the vocalist is trying to hit. So let's take a look at this part. I've just narrowed it down here to this section. And I'm actually going to split this clip here. So I'm going to highlight this area and I'm going to hit Command E to split the clip. Now we just have this section. I'm going to select this highlighted area and I'm going to hit Command L to loop it. That way it's just a bit easier for us to work with. Okay, we've got this. Now let's look at the tuner. So I'm going to play this and then we'll actually look at what's happening down here. When you're playing a sound that goes into the tuner, whichever note is displayed down here is the note that is closest to whatever's playing. So here we have a C sharp. If I go, let's say, to another section, kind of switching between F sharp and E flat there. But we'll come back to this section, just look at this. So the note she's trying to hit here is a C sharp. Except if she was hitting a C sharp perfectly, this would be green and a dot would be here, not down here. So what this is telling us is because it's on the left, the dot, that means that she's singing a touch flat. So we need to bring her up slightly to bring her in pitch. Now, how do we do that? Let's take a look at these numbers first. So we got 0 here and a -50 here. If we just look at this line, we can kind of predict that here is -25 and here would be, say, -12 and then here would be roughly 37. So if I just play her note here, kind of sitting around that negative, say 20-ish, and you can also use the numbers here, but that's going to fluctuate quite a bit. So you can use the visual representation as well. I'd say she's probably sitting at -20 cents-wise to C sharp. So to fix this, we need to counter that. What we do is double click on this clip that we've split. But before I go changing anything, I want to actually consolidate this section. So I'm going to hit Command J or Control J. Now we consolidated this little bit. There's no other information in here, just this note. You do want to make sure that the section you're tuning is warped, because if it's not, and you start changing the pitch, you can see that it's actually changing the length of the clip, and we do not want that at all. So if we put warp on, so let me just go back. Don't think I've covered this. If I select warp now, you'll get this little option. What this essentially means is if you've warped it before and you want to go back to what you had, you select no, because then it'll go back to the previous markers. If you go yes, it'll just insert new markers to retain the timing. So that's all that means if you've seen that pop up and you're wondering what it was. I usually just go whatever I need to, but if I can't remember what the last warp markers were, I'll just select yes to insert some new ones. Now that we have this section consolidated, and we know that we're sitting -20 of C sharp, we can go back into our consolidated clip with warp on, and we can tune this up 20 cents. So let's take a look at the pitch now. Now she's pretty much perfectly on key for the majority of that extended note. Whereas before she was a touch flat. Another thing we want to do before we move on is change this from beats, because if we leave it on beats, it can introduce, depending on how much you push this, but you can start getting some artifacting like I was showing you, like we know about by now with the samples and bringing audio tracks in. So we want to set this to, as usual, I think complex works the best for most of the time. So I always like to use complex for vocals. Okay. So there are going to be some slight fluctuations either side. It's impossible to get it perfectly in the middle, and you probably don't want it to. Otherwise, you're going to lose a lot of character in the voice. So when I say artists like Beyonce and Ed Sheeran have been auto-tuned, this is basically what I mean. It's such a minor thing that you don't notice it, but it just helps in keeping the overall track completely in pitch, which sounds more pleasant at the end. Okay, so that's sitting there nicely now. Let's try another section.
Live, live, live.
This is the same thing. She's hitting that same note. Except here, she's a touch flat, but it's not much. It's like 10, it's like 5 to 10 cents this time. So I won't worry about that section. We'll come back to another section. Okay, let's take this. I just want the beginning of this life part. Just watch out that when you split your clips like this and you're tuning in Ableton, that you don't capture a glide down to another note, because you don't want to tune that as well. You just want to tune a sustained note. Okay, so I can quite safely tune this. If I added too much, see how I get that glide down as well? I don't want to tune that or affect that. So I'm just going to come back to here. Okay, I'm going to split this. I already split the clip, so it's ready to go. First things first, I need to consolidate it, because we still have all this other information which we don't want. Consolidate that, and then make sure warp is on with complex. Let's take a look at the tuner again. So this time she's trying to hit E flat. As you can see, it's there. Right at the end where she glides down, she switches to a D something. Or a C sharp, but there's a D in between. But for this note here, she's trying to hit an E flat. So in this case, because she's on this side of the tuner, she's actually singing a touch sharp. So we need to bring her back down ever so slightly to bring her in pitch. So we can take a look at a combination of the numbers and where the dot is sitting. So I'm just looking at where she sustains there right at the end, which is around here. Yeah, so that's around 10 to 12. Let's double click this little clip. Because she's singing sharp, we want to go back down. Bring this down 12 to start with and see how that sits. Okay. Yeah, now she's green for the majority of that notes. And that's what we want to see. Let me unloop that and play this whole sentence.
Wanna live life. Oh, oh.
Okay, so that's those sections tuned. One thing that you might notice if you listen very carefully, if we just look at this section here, when it crosses over onto that new adjusted tuned clip, there's a slight bounce of the volume. This is because Ableton likes to put in automatic crossfades between each clip to blend the two. So if you're getting some weirdness in between each clip, like there, just a slight little volume dip, what we can do is jump in and then play around with the crossfades until that goes away. That's even worse. Okay, so that's smoothed it out a little bit there. It's super minor, so you're not going to hear it, especially once you have instruments over the top. Unfortunately, it's just one of those cases because we have warped it and we've tuned it and then we changed the pitch mode slightly. It's not going to be a perfect transition to like how it was. So we just need to smooth that over using the crossfades. So you can try getting rid of the crossfades entirely by dragging this in. Whereas for me there, that clicks even worse. So I can just drag the crossfade back out. And then that smooths it over. If you can't see these little crossfade boxes, that's because you're in automation mode. So if I turn my keyboard off by hitting M and then hit A, you can see I can't actually get those boxes anymore. So to bring up those crossfades, we have to turn off automation mode by hitting A on our keyboard. You do have to make sure your keyboard is off first. So if you press A, you're going to try and play notes. To make sure the keyboard is off up there, hit A to turn off automation, so we don't want that on. And then you'll see your crossfades. Essentially, this just fades in between clips, so you can make the transition much smoother, and you can really edit those. If I have a massive crossfade like this, you can see I'm getting doubling up of voices there. So I'm just going to undo that. Okay, just wanted to make a note on that in case you had some tuned sections that weren't transitioning nicely with the old sections. You just have to play around with that until you get something that sounds a bit smoother.
Wanna live life.
So there we're getting quite a big volume dip. I'm going to play with this. I'll try and get rid of it first. Yeah. So getting rid of it there definitely helped a lot. If I wanted to get rid of that tiny little crackle, I could probably play around with the crossfades a little bit more. But yeah, I've pretty much covered what I needed to for this video. That's essentially how we auto-tune in Ableton with built-in features. So we don't need any extra plugins. As you saw before, it is much easier to auto-tune with the plugin because you can just literally throw it on anything and press a button and it does the tuning for you. But if you don't want to buy plugins and you don't need that much auto-tune, you can use this method where you split the clip up and then tune each one separately using the tuner and going in and detuning it however much you need. Just make sure you remember warp is on, with typically complex will work the best, and then check those crossfades in between the clips. That pretty much wraps it up for this one. Hopefully you'll find the gate useful for, especially in that last exercise. You might have had a lot of background noise, which now you know how to cut that out. Just try not to cut out too much, so you want to find a nice balance between getting rid of background noise and not actually eating into your sound and cutting off those edges too much. We'll come back in the next video and we'll wrap up for the week and also talk about what we'll be looking at next week. So I'll see you then.